What this says about me, but yesterday as we were putting the finishing touches on the thesis in the dining room, I think it was one of my favorite days of the year. I really, really enjoyed working together. Might have been nice to have spread it out a little bit more, but it was really, I think, one of the best parts about supervising a thesis is getting to work with a student on in an area that they're really passionate about, and to see it all kind of come together. So I just want to, everyone knows Dan. I just want to offer just a word of prayer as we get started and then turn it over to Dan. So if you haven't been here before, the format is, I think, about a 30-minute presentation where Dan will read from his thesis, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Okay? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for the many steps that it's taken to bring Dan to this point where he's ready to share his research and his thinking with us. And I pray that as we listen to Dan, that we would listen intently, that we would hear not only what Dan is saying in terms of the words, but that we would see even deeper into the truths of the things that he's talking about in the area of food. And Father, that you would just quicken our spirits, that we might even learn from this something that we can do as advocates for a more just world. Father, I commit this time to you. I pray to be with Dan, just help him to speak clearly and well, and just help him to just really enjoy this time, and help all of us to have a good time together as we learn. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, first of all, I never actually thought that I was going to be doing a thesis. It never really struck me as something I wanted to do until about maybe end of semester before the summer break last year. And then Lois was helping me get involved in a few different things surrounding food. And I started getting really interested in food, and then started thinking about it more, and had some ideas of things that I could research, and this was a really good way to allow myself to actually research. So I decided to do it. And the outcome has been a thesis with the title, The Industrialization of Food, the Paradox of Industrial Agriculture in a Hungry World. And so the way that I'm going to do this is I'm just going to read through the thesis, not cover to cover because it's a little too long. Although, as I was looking through it today, I kind of wanted to do that because I was actually happy with it. So I've highlighted a few different sections that I'm going to go through. And I guess at the end of, whenever I'm done, then you guys can ask some questions. I think we'll, instead of asking them during, maybe wait till I'm done reading. And yeah. So I'm going to start out with my introduction and then kind of go through the thesis. And I'm going to start with a quote. And I just want to be sure that when I'm reading quotes, I have to say in quotation or something. Is that
Begin it with quote and then say it, and say end quote.
Okay. So I have an interesting quote. It's from Richard Robbins. To understand why people go hungry, you must stop thinking about food as something farmers grow for others to eat, and begin thinking about it as something companies produce for other people to buy. Food is a commodity. Food is an issue of universal concern. And now it's me talking. Food is an issue of universal concern. Everyone on the planet needs to eat in order to survive. This makes food from production through distribution to consumption one of the most important and fundamental issues facing humanity, now and in the future. Roughly 1 billion people on the planet go to bed hungry every night, while on the other end of the spectrum, 1.4 billion people are overweight or obese. With all indicators suggesting that the world population will continue to grow, peaking at around 9 billion by 2050, the questions of how we will feed ourselves is of vital importance. The purpose of this thesis is to pull a lot of different issues together that are often separated when people discuss the current food system. Many authors focus on the health consequences of eating processed foods, while others focus on the problem of overconsumption of meat products. Still, others look at the agricultural aspects of how these practices are destroying our environment. And some authors writing in different fields look at capitalism and talk about its failings. Although there is often some overlap between these topics, these are only the symptoms of a bigger issue. few people actually attempt to connect the dots in order to discover what is behind these symptoms. In this thesis, I will present the view that the commodification of food inherent in a capitalist economic system is the root cause of all the problems that I have mentioned above. It all boils down to the idea of maximizing profit that comes with capitalism. When profit is the starting point and the center of how things are organized and operated, there are a whole range of issues that emerge. Having profit maximization as the ultimate goal of food production pushes things like environmental conservation, nutritional quality, consumer health, and conditions for agricultural employees onto the periphery. They only become important when they start to hurt profit or when activists push for more stringent regulations and policies. This thesis is a discourse on food. It starts with the history of food and how humans have interacted with it over the years, tracking significant changes that have happened along the way. This thesis consists of 3 chapters. The purpose of the first chapter will be to give an overview of the history of food in general, looking at some of the broader changes that took place leading to the current industrial food system. The second chapter will continue from here, focusing in on the more specific changes that allowed the food system to industrialize. It will do so through the lens of economic capitalism, showing how the emergence of capitalism allowed the changes to take place. The second chapter will lay the foundation for my assertion that capitalism, the unbridled pursuit of profit-making through food production and distribution, is the underlying issue. Finally, the last chapter will look extensively at the consequences of an industrialized food system and will serve to illustrate the unsavory practical consequences of adopting and maintaining a profit-driven industry. This research has inspired me to consider possible solutions to the various food crises that are increasingly plaguing our planet. So I will conclude by offering an opinion on how best to proceed with solving the problem of feeding all people in the world in a way that is both healthy for the consumer and sustainable for the planet. That's my introduction. And I'm mostly just going to summarize the first 2 chapters because I found my third chapter to be the most interesting because it focuses really in on the consequences. But I'll read to you a few parts of the first 2 chapters also. So basically for the first chapter, I focused in on 3 segments of time and 3 different changes, broad changes, that led towards the industrialization of food. So being an overview of the history of food, I pulled in a few different ideas from different authors to create 3 segments of time that I thought were the most important. So the first of these was the time when humans were hunter-gatherers. And this is like the broad changes in food. So first of all, when humans were hunter-gatherers. The second was the transition away from this towards agriculture. And then the third was the transition towards industrial agriculture. So I talked a little bit about these in this chapter. And so the first segment of time, the hunter-gatherer, I'm going to leave out a little bit and focus more on the agricultural side because it's more of a just setting the stage for the discussion in the thesis. So agriculture really started to present itself by 6000 BC when humans had domesticated sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. And that's a quote by Paul Roberts. And by 5000 BC, agriculture had made its way around the world to every continent save Australia. Although the process was a long one, by 3500 BC, a surplus of wheat by Egyptian farmers allowed people to experience food security, essentially starting humans on the path to viewing food more as a commodity than a necessity. These surpluses provided food security. Quote from Paul Roberts. Provided food security, something inconceivable to our hunting forebears. And they also gave people something to trade, thus forming the basis of commerce, end quote. As some farmers became increasingly concerned with profit and ways of maximizing profit, commercial food operations became larger and more complex. Quote from Paul Roberts, requiring careful husbanding of various inputs, seed, feed, labor, and eventually technology. End quote. And so I'll just continue reading through the first chapter. From this time until roughly the 1930s, the greatest advancements in commercial and industrial agriculture were developments in new farm technologies. These time and energy saving changes, along with an increase in the scale of production, saw grain yields in Europe almost double between 1300 and 1600. Although the development of new mechanized farm equipment and massive increases in the scale of production are surely significant factors in the development of industrial agriculture, things began to change drastically in the 1920s and 1930s. In these years, scientists at federal and state research centers in the United States were beginning to apply scientific knowledge to agriculture. This research resulted in, quote from Paul Roberts, hybrid strains of corn that not only had bigger, more plentiful ears, but also grew more closely together in the field, all of which meant more corn per acre. Between 1930 and 1940, the number of bushels of corn per acre doubled, and then continued to rise each year, end quote. This research into seed varieties that produce greater quantities of produce reflects an essential component of industrial agriculture, which favors quantity over quality when it comes to producing food. Although there is the potential for varieties that are both nutritionally superior and have higher yields, the food industry seems content with the high yields while ignoring the nutritional deficiencies of the food it is producing. Not only was quantity favored, but so was uniformity, as consumers quickly came to prefer produce that looked more appealing. It's just the way it looks. As things progressed, seeds started being designed for more convenient harvest. And a quote from Paul Roberts again. Because it was cheaper to breed plants for machine harvest than to design a mechanical harvester to cope with non-uniform plants, eventually all commercial produce would be engineered so as to place the harvested parts in a predictable position in relation to the harvest machine. Or, as another journal put it, machines are not made to harvest crops. In reality, crops must be designed to be harvested by machines. End quote. So the result of these changes in seed have resulted in vast monocultures of a tiny group of plants, replacing the diversified farms that used to feed us. Monoculture is another major aspect of industrial agriculture, a topic that will be explored in more depth later on. So this tendency to shape nature around human innovation, specifically farm technology in this case, reflects a shift in the general philosophy of the West. This philosophy helps spur on specific changes to agriculture and how they connect to the technologies developed around that time. Technologies that could have been used to improve agriculture in a mutually beneficial way for both nature and humanity. Despite the potential for a more holistic approach to nutritional progress, the new worldview that developed further from the Industrial Revolution went in another direction. Emphasizing the capability of humanity to dominate nature, agriculture was developed in a way whereby nature was altered to work better with new technologies, rather than new technologies being created and designed to work better with nature. Nature became an object to be used and controlled, specifically for economic purposes, with little concern to long-term effects and consequences. So then in the rest of the chapter I go into a little bit more some of the aspects of the nutritional side of the result of how agriculture is done now, giving a few quotes on the nutritional deficiencies that have emerged and how companies often add value to products so that they take raw materials that, like just say like corn, and then they turn them into something else like high fructose corn syrup, and then they use that to create all these different products that we see in the supermarkets. And that's often how they make most of their money, is by taking something like corn and adding all these steps on top of it in order to increase their profit and completely change that food into something that is just you and recognize it based on how it started. And so there's a lot of details in there, so I decided not to really go into it too much. I don't want to bore you guys. So from here I'm going to go into my second chapter. And this one focuses in on capitalism a little bit, how it emerged, and also on some of the specific changes that took place in production of food, especially off the farm. So this chapter will build on the historical overview of food, offering a more focused look into the development of the industrial food production model. Much of this chapter will consider food production off of the farm. It will begin with a brief overview of the emergence of economic capitalism, with a strong focus on the social and economic changes, more relevant to shaping the way the food and agricultural system would eventually develop. From here, this chapter will delve into what those specific areas of development were, and how they have affected food and the way it is both processed and distributed. Although capitalists existed for some time before capitalism, and here I refer to capitalists as people who invest money in the hopes of making a monetary return on their investment, capitalism started emerging in the 18th century around the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism is, quote by James Fulcher, essentially the investment of money in the expectation of making a profit. In capitalism proper, the whole economy becomes dependent on the investment of capital, and thus occurs when it is not just trade that is financed in this way, but production as well, end quote. Before the economic system of capitalism emerged, people who wished to invest money to make a profit did not control production. The goods that they sold were items not typically produced in the home. This meant they were selling a very limited variety of goods, with the result that their actions, including profit and losses, did not have far-reaching influences on the economy as a whole. Capitalists were mostly limited to trade, often pouring their capital into trading expeditions. They made their money by selling luxury items like pepper, cloves, nutmegs, and other items. Meaning, quote from James Fulcher, profit was quite simply the result of scarcity and distance. It was made from the huge difference between the price paid for, say, pepper in the Spice Islands and the price it fetched in Europe, a difference that dwarfed the costs of the venture, end quote. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, most people began to work in factories in order to make wages. By earning wages and spending a large portion of their time working in those factories, or working for a set number of hours per day, the control of production shifted from individuals and families to companies. This transition resulted in an economic system where, quote from James Fulcher, wage laborers cannot themselves produce what they need or may wish to consume. They have to buy it, therefore providing the demand that activates a whole range of new capitalist enterprises, end quote. This dependence on wages and the dependence it then created between laborers and companies is where the relationship between humans and their food changed significantly. People began losing control of their food once they were forced to buy it from other people on a more regular basis. Roger Beaudoin, founder and director of the nonprofit group Kitchen Gardeners International, describes one aspect of what this loss of control has meant today and how to combat it. Quote from him, "Food is a form of energy. It's what our bodies run on, but it is also a form of power. And when we encourage people to grow some of their own food, we're encouraging them to take power into their hands. Power over their diet, power over their health, and some power over their pocketbooks." So I think that's quite subversive, because we're also necessarily talking about taking that power away from somebody else, from other actors in society that currently have power over food and health, end quote. He goes on to say that we should imagine ourselves who these actors in society are. So it's safe to say that these actors are the large food corporations that have control over where our food comes from and how it's produced. So the changes that took place within the society back during the Industrial Revolution saw this power being handed over to increasingly larger companies. Although these companies started out small, with limited power over people's health and diets, they have expanded over time until they emerged as a very, very powerful sector of the economy, generating billions of dollars a year in revenue. The situation we are in now is one where people have limited control and power over their diets. And then now I go into some of the specific changes that took place in the way that food was produced. And again, it's not really on the farm, so it's not the way farming practices adapted. It's more once those the produce left the farm, they were transformed into something else elsewhere. So I'm focusing more on that side of it, so processing food. So according to writer Jack Goody, there were 4 immediate factors that made the development of an industrial cuisine in the West possible. These were developments in preserving, mechanization, retailing, and wholesale, and transportation. So I'm not going to go into all of them specifically, but I am going to read a few different things that I thought were a little bit more like the most interesting of those developments. But those were the main things that really saw changes in industrial food. So coming back a little bit to the wage labor and that change, I'm going to start off from that side of things. So one of the perspectives of the changing labor demands brought about by the Industrial Revolution was a widespread trend towards earlier breakfasts and later dinners. And one consequence of this shift was a dramatic increase in the demand for biscuits, which is kind of interesting. Because people had more distance between when they were eating in the morning or in the afternoon, so they needed something to snack on. So it's kind of where things started, you know, like you go into an Irving here, and there's snack food all over the place, right? Because people have some distance between when they normally eat. So I think that's really where it started, is with biscuits.
Do you mean cookies, sort of biscuits?
Yeah, like I think they were also called hardtack. So it's yeah, kind of like a cookie. So that, I'm not going to go much into the rest of those sides of things, I guess. I thought I had more notes on it, but I don't. So I'm going to skip it actually. So now I'm going to go into my 3rd chapter. And the 3rd chapter really focuses on the consequences. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about are things that are happening because of the practices developed by an industrial food system. And I'm going to separate them a little bit between practices on the farm, so consequences of farming practices, and consequences of the way that food is processed. So starting out, I'm going to look at some of the problems with the agricultural side of it on the farm. So one of these things is the accumulation of toxic agricultural inputs into ground and surface waters. It is both an environmental concern and a health one. Harmful ingredients found in pesticides do not disappear after the chemical solution has been applied. Instead, they collect and/or move into the air, water, and soil. Pesticides and herbicides in agriculture are used to eliminate unwanted insect and plant life, like so-called pests and weeds. The U.S. Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, has conducted studies on the prevalence of atrazine contamination in water sources, including drinking water. And atrazine is a chemical found in pesticides. So atrazine is found in pesticides and herbicides and is the most commonly detected pesticide in U.S. water. Although banned in Europe, in the European Union in 2004, atrazine is still one of the most widely used pesticides in the United States. Some of the recommendations from the NRDC for how to reduce this contamination are targeted at farmers. In 2004, they made the following statement, quote, "Farmers should take immediate steps to reduce their use of atrazine, including increasing reliance on a variety of non-chemical techniques for weed control. These include crop rotation, the use of winter cover crops, alternating rows of different crops, and mechanical weed control methods. Additionally, timing fertilizer application to coincide with the periods of greatest nutrient uptake by crops can avoid unnecessary fertilizer use that would fuel weed growth." However, The pollution of water by pesticides and herbicides is not the only way these chemicals affect the environment and health. By going into the air, water, and soil, pesticides and herbicides are responsible for adverse effects on animals and insects, especially bees, birds, fish, frogs, earthworms, and other insects. These adverse effects include the death of animals and insects, along with hormonal and endocrine changes, resulting in things like the feminization of male fish, birds, and mammals, decreased fertility in birds, fish, shellfish, and mammals, and birth deformities in birds, fish, and turtles. Runoff from chemical fertilizers from fields into water systems occurs when there is an excess of nutrients in the soil that is not being absorbed by plants, because plants are only capable of absorbing a certain amount of nutrients. When these nutrients reach water sources, they cause pollution by, quote, from pesticide-free BC, stimulating the rapid growth of algae, which reduces the aesthetic and recreational values of waterways and harms many other living organisms, end quote. This pollution depletes the amount of oxygen found in the water during the process of decomposition of the algae, which eventually kills fish and other organisms living in the water. This problem is not exclusive to plant agriculture, but also concentrated animal feeding operations, known as CAFOs, or CAFOs, I think, including the aquaculture industry. In these cases, the overabundance of nutrients are a result of the massive amounts of animal waste created by the operations, which in the case of CAFOs are often stored in open-air pits or lagoons, and eventually sprayed in liquid form onto surrounding land, which itself may eventually move from that land into water resources. In the case of some industrial aquaculture operations, like salmon farming along the eastern coast of Canada, the feces from thousands of fish that are concentrated and netted off areas in the ocean go directly into the water. Although it is normal for fish to excrete in the water, the concentration of so many fish can lead to a similar overabundance of nutrients, causing problems with algae and the death of aquatic organisms. Another important impact that has the potential to be a devastating consequence of industrial agriculture, if it is not corrected, is the use of irrigation systems that pump water from sources faster than they are being replenished. Although plants and animals need water to thrive, thus making water an important and necessary component of agriculture and life in general, industrial agriculture has, quote from Grace Communications Foundation, magnified the pressure on already overstretched water resources through its expansion of industrial-scale cultivation of water-intensive crops and feedlots on more marginal land, end quote. This requires a greater degree of water input. Although the problem is not a simple one, some of the reasons behind the extensive use of water are the massive scale of operations. The decision on the part of farmers and agribusiness to plant crops that require more water, and the decision to plant more crops on marginal land that is not necessarily ideal for crops being grown. A driving force behind these decisions is industry's obsession with economic efficiency, or the desire to produce agricultural goods as cheaply as possible in order to make the most money from their investment. By doing so, farmers are indirectly encouraged to plant more crops in order to make up for the lower prices they are receiving for what they produce. An example of how this impacts water usage and farmers is a trend in America for farmers to increase, quote from Winona Hodder, corn cultivation in more arid regions of the high plains and the Rockies, quote. It is important to note that agriculture is the single largest use of water worldwide, with irrigated cultivation accounting for 660 trillion to 1 quadrillion gallons of water use annually. I don't even know what 1 quadrillion is. That's just like ridiculous. The disappearance of the Aral Sea is a well-known example of what can happen when water for irrigation is poorly managed. It is an illustration that exemplifies the downside of industrial agriculture and the philosophy of domination over nature, in this case with the production of cotton in Central Asia in a climate requiring more water usage in general. The Aral Sea, you might have been wondering what it is, was once the 4th largest freshwater lake in the world, but since the 1960s has experienced a drastic decline to where it has now nearly disappeared from the earth. Not only has the sea almost completely disappeared, but the pesticides and salts that were settled on the floor of the lake are now exposed, posing serious health risks to local residents who are now experiencing chronic anemia from salty tap water and a plethora of respiratory conditions. This focus on production at any human and environmental cost is unfortunately not exclusive to the Aral Sea, as it is often intertwined with industrial agriculture and its search for economic efficiency at any or almost any cost. And then from here I jump into a few other things like soil erosion. I have 5 minutes left. So I'm not going to talk about soil erosion. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pathogens that make their way into our food system. So the health problems that arise from the massive amounts of animal waste produced from CAFOs is the ability of manure from these areas of production to be transferred into the fields of plant-based agricultural operations. Although this may not immediately come to mind as a health concern, due to the common practice of using animal manure as fertilizer, the nature of the specific manure is of concern. Due to the conditions in which animals are raised, like cows and pigs for example, animals are often more susceptible to diseases from pathogens like E. coli. The extremely close quarters that these animals live in means they are unable to move around freely, or are not able to move around very much, which results in the accumulation of feces. Now there's also other reasons for some of the health concerns with these animals, but I wasn't able to delve into that. I didn't focus very much on the meat industry, because I felt like I could have done a completely other thesis on that topic. So the animals spend a lot of time standing around and living in their own excrement, which is mostly responsible for the increase in stronger pathogens. Because of this, producers have begun using massive amounts of antibiotics to combat disease from the conditions that these animals live in. Over time, things like E. coli can start to build up a resistance to these antibiotics, thus increasing in number and in strength. The pathogen can then come out and live in the manure for some time, and can be transferred over into the plant-based operation when, quote from Paul Roberts, a feral pig, say, or a stray cow, or even a bird, picks up the E. coli from cow manure on a nearby ranch, and then runs through the field and craps, end quote. The contaminant can also be transferred into agricultural fields when there is a heavy rain that carries the manure from its natural reservoirs, such as cattle pastures, down the hillsides and into the valley below, where it then has access to the agricultural complex through thousands of fixed points, such as irrigation wells, canals, and ditches. And then another way that this can be transferred is through dust. And this one I thought was really interesting. Paul Roberts, the guy I've been quoting a little bit, he talks about how when that manure that's been spread out over the land dries, then it can become dusty. So if an animal kicks or something, that dust can go up into there, get caught into the wind, and fly away for a little while and land in another field. And so that's how it can get transferred sometimes. And then he gives an example of how once it lands in the field and attaches itself to some of those plants being grown, it can work its way into the food system. And I believe they've done some research in this where they actually traced one of an outbreak of E. coli back to how this whole thing happened. So a quote from Paul Roberts. The huge mowing machines that growers rely on leave cuts on the spinach and salad greens. So he's talking about fields of spinach. Wounds that not only provide the E. coli with a place to attach itself, but also give it a source of nutrient-rich leaf juice. And as soon as the E. coli begins to feed and replicate on the leaf, it is given the perfect opportunity to spread its progeny. The freshly harvested greens are mixed with hundreds of pounds of other greens and thousands of gallons of water in the processing plant. This procedure not only provides E. coli with lots of moisture, which it craves, but it also gives the germs virtually unlimited opportunities to touch and potentially contaminate other freshly cut leaves. Processors work hard to interrupt this pathogenic cascade. Spinach and other greens are sent down huge water-filled flumes in order to physically dislodge the bacteria, then dumped into chlorinated water, then kept in refrigerated warehouses, trucks, and display cases until the consumer buys it. But these measures are proving insufficient against the newest strands of E. coli, end quote. Okay. So that's one way in which the pathogens can make their way into the food system, and you can see that the large scale of operations makes it much easier for it to spread. So that's one of the problems with industrial agriculture is its size. It has the benefit of producing a lot of food, but it creates problems like this where something like a foodborne illness that might have been just a very small occurrence with one person eating that lettuce or that spinach can affect a lot of people based on how they're doing things. So another important health concern is the impact pesticides have on health.
You're kind of on borrowed time, but
Okay.
it's your time.
Another important concern is the impacts pesticides have on human health, with a long list of disturbing and frightening consequences. For example, companies like Dole, Chiquita, and Del Monte, especially in Guatemala and the Caribbean, often proceed with aerial fumigation while their workers are on the plantations, despite warnings posted to advise the public not to enter the premises during fumigation. Here the workers are being poisoned by the chemicals they are supposed to apply to the bananas. The application of such toxic chemicals on the food supply is a hallmark of industrial agriculture, and thus it comes as no surprise that many people are becoming aware of such practices and raising concerns about their overall consequences. Although the example of Dole and Del Monte is an extreme case, it is unfortunately more common than one might think, especially in the developing world where many companies intentionally disregard the health impacts of industrial chemicals on hired workers in order to save money and make a bigger profit. Pesticides can affect anyone who comes into contact with them, and some of the health consequences related to pesticide exposure include asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, cancers, hormone imbalance, endocrine disruption, learning disabilities such as autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and delayed development, and both childhood and adult leukemia and neurological conditions such as Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, these are just some of the effects pesticides have on human health. Much of the contact with pesticides that results in these diseases and illnesses occurs when pesticides are carried in the air, water, and soil. However, pesticides can also come into contact when their residue is still present on food that is consumed, or when the chemical resides in the food itself. Right. I'm almost done. Another major topic of concern revolving around the health impacts of food produced by the industrial food system goes beyond the potential harm of pesticides and other agricultural practices to the actual makeup of the food itself. In fact, the impacts are so widely known that the name Western diet has been coined to describe it. The Western diet can best be described as one with, quote from Michael Pollan, lots of processed foods and meat, lots of added fat and sugars, lots of everything except fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. The recorded side effects of a diet like this, combined with the often sedentary lifestyle that comes with it, include obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and a specific set of diet-related cancers. So one of the main concerns with the processed foods people consume is that in one way or another, they have sugar put into it, and this greatly contributes to the problem of obesity. This is made possible with high fructose corn syrup, which I kind of touched on earlier, which can be easily and cheaply produced thanks to the high rate of subsidies being directed towards the production of corn. Humans are also naturally inclined to seek out foods that are sweet, because typically fruits are ripe. Because typically fruits are ripe or at their best state to be consumed when they taste sweet. Food companies have exploited this human desire for sweetness by making most processed foods sweet, thus attracting people more strongly to them. And actually, I just kind of did my own research in the grocery store looking at ingredients, and you'll often find in things that you might not expect sugar to be in, that there's sugar in there, which is just kind of interesting. So the problem with these additional sweeteners being put into food is that they are deceptive to the body. In describing this issue, author Michael Pollan states, quote, "Ripeness, which is the moment when the seeds of the plant are ready to go off and germinate, typically coincides with the greatest concentration of nutrients in a fruit. So the interests of the plant for transportation align with those of the plant eater for nutriment. Our bodies, having received these signals and determined this fruit is good to eat, now produce in anticipation precisely the enzymes and acids needed to break it down. Health depends heavily on knowing how to read these biological signals. This looks ripe. This smells spoiled. That's one slick-looking cow." This is much easier to do when you have a long experience of a food, and much harder to do when a food has been expressly designed to deceive your senses with, say, artificial flavors or synthetic sweeteners. Foods that lie to our senses are one of the most challenging features of the Western diet. Because these foods are deceiving consumers into thinking they are nutritionally prime, people who eat them think they are getting the nutrients their bodies need. The reality is that these foods often have little to no nutritional value and are being designed to keep people coming back to eat them. This is essentially what the modern industrial food system is trying to accomplish, as it is a business within a capitalist economic system that is trying to maximize profits. In order to do this, it must continue to sell more food to consumers in whatever way possible. This is really interesting because food is something that you might think you do have a limit to how much you can consume, right? So companies keep pushing this limit and pushing this limit and pushing this limit by making different ways for us to be able to eat more and encouraging us to eat more. So although it is true that consumers do have a say in what companies are selling, because businesses must cater to the wants and needs of their customers if they are to succeed, this does not stop them from trying very hard to influence buying habits in favor of greater profit to their companies. The trap created by companies is that their food is artificially manipulated to be very tasty, but lacking in adequate nutrition. So when people eat processed foods, they might eat a large enough portion, but their bodies will still feel as though they need more food to receive enough nutrition. This trap leads to obesity because many people are overeating. The result is, a quote from Michael Pollan, "The human being who manages to be both overfed and undernourished." End quote. This creates significant strain on healthcare systems because it leads to those Western diseases discussed earlier, such as obesity and diabetes. Not only does processed food have significant health consequences, but major economic ones as well. This is not to say that all processed foods are bad, but that a majority of them are because of the extra ingredients that are added in order to make them addictive and have a longer shelf life. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip right ahead to my conclusion, and I'm just going to read that as a final part of my thesis to you all. So the current food system is unsustainable. Its trajectory of development has led to a plethora of problems and a state of instability. It is clear to many, not only in the industry, but to governments and think tanks around the world, that this system must change its practices and goals if we are to survive. The direction and way in which change must occur, however, is intensely debated. Although there are people on both sides of the argument for or against industrial food production, some proposing that small-scale food production would be sufficient for feeding the world, while others suggest that industrial methods and scale are the only way forward. I believe the solution lies somewhere in between small-scale agriculture and the industrial model. I believe the next stage in the history of food is something that could be described as post-industrial. It would be a food system that has the goal of providing enough food for every person on the planet, while carefully monitoring the various impacts on the environment, health, consumers, and workers. It would utilize modern technology whenever possible, but only under conditions where the technology use is consistent with the above goals of health and sustainability. This would effectively move the goal of profit maximization from the main focus to being on the periphery. However, the need to make profit would not be entirely removed. Food and agriculture could remain an important sector of the economy, even with the shift in focus. If companies are charged directly for the negative environmental and health impacts of their practices, for example, pollution, healthcare costs, and others, rather than passing these costs on to governments and their citizens, then alternative ways of producing food that are more sustainable and have lower impacts on these things would be very likely to become more attractive options. There are basically two ways in which I think things should proceed. Because capitalism itself is the problem, either it must be replaced by some other system, or policymakers must start treating it like the issue it is, by creating and shaping regulations, policies, rules, funding, subsidies, rewards, etc., anything that relates to it, in ways that will channel the momentum of big businesses and capitalist ventures surrounding food to be more in line with social and environmental concerns. Although perhaps preferable, the notion of replacing the capitalist system with something better seems very unlikely, at least in the near future. Therefore, the latter option is a more realistic and manageable goal. It includes primarily action from governments to change the system just enough through the above means so that the needs of the general public are more adequately met. This concept is not unique, as there are several sectors within the economy deemed important enough to be protected by the government. In Canada, the healthcare system is one of these. Although there are health and safety regulations currently in place for food, their content would be significantly different if food and its agricultural systems were recognized more as the vital systems they are than is currently the case. If agriculture shifted towards focusing on feeding the world in a healthy and sustainable manner, instead of generating as much profit as possible, there could still be industrial scale of operations as long as harmful effects are more stringently monitored and contained. In fact, there should be a minimal tolerance of practices that harm either consumer health or environmental sustainability. For example, the use of pesticides could be reserved for exceptional circumstances in cases of emergency, and the current global distribution network could remain intact, though on a much smaller scale, and be replaced by a much larger regional focus. The main source of food would shift back to being primarily local, with many products from around the world being used to supplement local supply where necessary from a nutritional perspective. The industrial food system has made it tremendously easy for food to be shipped around the world. This in itself is not a bad thing, but the scale on which it occurs is a problem. Limiting the amount of food distributed globally by reserving this kind of transportation for food aid and items being categorized as luxury items would be a more sustainable approach while still allowing people access to foods they have grown accustomed to eating.